I worry that the Conservative Party is going to dive into some sort of existential crisis about, are we too right-wing or are we too left-wing? And actually, I think the most important thing is, where did we go wrong in governing our country effectively? How did we lose that trust? And what did we do that made people really cut off and stop listening to us, irrespective of the policy platform? And that's something I hope that members do address and doesn't get lost in the noise that is bound to come over the coming weeks ahead.
Of course, a huge amount of political news making the papers today, including thoughts on where the Conservative Party goes next. A leadership contest is inevitably on the way, and the picking over of where the party went wrong is already well underway. One of those sharing his thoughts in today's Sunday Times is Conservative Mayor of the Tees Valley, Ben Houchen, and he joins us now. Good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to have you. I mean, let's start there, shall we? Because you have written about the future of the Conservative Party. What is your takeaway from this election?
I mean, it's a very complicated thing to dissect, and we're probably going to oversimplify this in the few minutes that we've got. But the intervention I made in the Sunday Times this morning was to try and make sure that the Conservative Party, and particularly those MPs that will be heavily involved in the leadership election and the process that is therefore going to take place, doesn't miss what I think is an essential thread of the leadership contest that we really need to dissect. So, having spoken to various MPs and members of the party this morning who've read the piece, they talk a lot about policy and whether we should be tougher on certain things. You know, do we want to lurch to the right? Do we want to try and stay in the centre ground? Are we too right-wing? Do we need to move to the left? But the intervention I made was a different one, in that I don't think in this election, certainly with hindsight, that there is a policy discussion and a set of policies we could have gone into this election that would have come with a Conservative victory. And the reason for that is, I think when we were speaking to people on the doorstep, and if you look at the wash-up, I don't think there was a massive vote for the Labour Party. I'm sure that's been discussed at length on Times Radio about vote share, etc., etc. The issue for the Conservative Party is one of competency and trust. I think the public lost trust in the Conservative Party to be able to govern effectively. I think there are examples going back a number of years that made people lose that level of trust. And therefore, the key tenet, I think, for a successful Conservative Party going back decades and decades is competency and being able to run the government in a competent fashion, being able to run the economy in a competent fashion. And I think things like, for example, our immigration policy was a lightning rod to people for a failure of that competency. So yes, there are interesting discussions about policy, but I worry that the Conservative Party is going to dive into some sort of existential crisis about, are we too right-wing or are we too left-wing? And actually, I think the most important thing is, where did we go wrong in governing our country effectively? How did we lose that trust? And what did we do that made people really cut off and stop listening to us, irrespective of the policy platform? And that's something I hope that members do address and doesn't get lost in the noise that is bound to come over the coming weeks ahead.
So in other words, I suppose, and it's not as simplistic as this, but this is part of your argument, it would be wrong for the party to look at reform and the number of places that reform came second, for example, in this election, and think that the answer would be to adopt a similar policy platform or even welcome Nigel Farage into the party.
Absolutely. My personal view is that, as I've just said, the Labour Party hasn't increased in popularity from 2019 or 2017. When you actually look at the raw data, again, I appreciate this is an oversimplification, but we are where we are with a few minutes to talk rather than a couple of hours. And what we saw was a number of people that I was speaking to, and again, we saw this on the doorstep. I didn't see a surge of Labour support across Teesside. Teesside historically is a very strong Labour area, just if you take out the last 5, 6, 7 years. And what we didn't see was a loss of confidence and trust in the Conservative Party, therefore I'm voting Labour. What we saw was, we've really fallen out of love with the Conservative Party. We don't trust them to be able to deliver. We're not really listening. We don't think you're competent anymore. There are issues around U-turns and infighting. But those people didn't go back to Labour. What they did is they then looked for the alternative. And the alternative for me was largely a protest vote. Again, there are some nuances within the reform kind of policy agenda, and Nigel Farage as a personality, absolutely. But if you look in, for example, places across the Red Wall, and not just Teesside, actually, you look at some interesting results that happened in places like Humberside and around Scunthorpe. Yes, we lost seats, but what we didn't see was a mass swing away from us by 10, 20, 30,000 votes. You know, there were a number of contests where we lost by a few hundred votes, up to 2,000 or 3,000 votes. Yeah. And again, these are areas that should have gone much stronger Labour. And actually, what we saw on the ground were Labour votes being leaked to Reform.
Yeah.
And I think it was that really causes the problem.
Which takes us to one of the most important questions then, which is there anyone in your party that you can see currently who's in a position to take on the leadership, who would fit the kind of ideas that you're talking about?
I mean, it's too early to really kind of get into that, to be honest. And the honest answer from my personal point of view is I'm unsure at the minute, because all I've heard so far are a couple of people come out and have that other debate, which I'm hoping that people will have, but also not forget this debate, which is, we need to be more reformy. We need to be much stronger on things like immigration and justice policy and all that kind of stuff. And I think that what we need is some really grown-up conversations to happen, because, as I said in the piece, our road back to redemption and our road back to government can be as long or as short as we want to make it to be.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to a group of hopefully leadership contenders who want to have a grown-up conversation rather than overly simplistic. Do we want to be as far right as Reform, or do we want to go further to try and pinch the movement them, or do we want to sit in the centre ground? That's part of the conversation, but the other part of it, I think, is much more important.
Before we move on, because I want to talk to you about free ports, we just had Jonathan Reynolds on talking about that. Lots of people say, well, the only answer really is Boris Johnson, that he's the only figure who can unite this party now in a way that he did in 2019. What do you say to them?
I can understand the appeal of Boris. I mean, I supported Boris from the beginning, and I think it was wrong for us to have gotten rid of him when we did. Whether it would have made any difference, who knows? There's a lot of water that went under the bridge even after Boris Johnson left government. I think that where we are at the moment as a party, given how significant the defeat was, and it was a defeat for the Conservative Party, I do agree with John Curtis when it says that the Conservatives lost this election rather than Labour really winning it. And I think I take it in the way that that's not to disparage the Labour Party, it's to show how much of a defeat this was to the Conservative Party. And again, the idea that Boris Johnson is I think generally a very popular person, I think could actually improve the Conservative Party. I think we're in a much more difficult place than bringing Boris Johnson back and assuming all is going to be fine at home and we can just move straight back into government. It's much, much more complicated than that. It goes much deeper now. And again, because we've lost the trust of a lot of these people, who, particularly those people who voted for us for the first time in 2019, who did lend us their vote and wanted the excuse to vote for us, I think it's actually much harder to rebuild that trust with those people who did vote for us for the first time in 2019. And so that road to redemption could be a long one if we're not careful.
It's actually... our listeners pointing out the second anniversary of Boris Johnson standing down. In spite of your admiration for him, do you not think that he is now fatally tarnished as, a proven liar and all the other problems? I mean, is it possible for him to make a comeback as the national leader?
I think the honest answer to that, Adam, is that I don't think Boris is part of the conversation. I don't know, I've not spoken to him about it, but I would be surprised if Boris wanted to throw his hat into the ring for the leadership contest. He's currently not an MP, and I don't see any by-elections happening anytime soon for that to happen. I don't get a sense from the Conservative Party that they're in the mood to rewrite all of the party rules on leadership contests just for Boris Johnson. So I would more caution the media in this, that trying to make our leadership contest about whether Boris should come back or not, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's helpful or realistic in the Conservative Party for people to talk about it. We need to get serious about who is left, because from where we were a week ago, there aren't that many people left, relatively speaking, and we need to get serious about somebody who wants to do the hard yards and really rebuild the Conservative Party, because it can still go the other way. If we do something overly simplistic and we ignore the lessons that the public are trying to teach us, then things can still get worse for the Conservative Party.
We just asked Jonathan Reynolds about free ports, about what Labour would do about free ports, and he said he won't close any down that exist already, he won't change the tax breaks that exist already, but it's not a policy that Labour is going to continue with. Do you think that's the right move?
Well, I'm relieved, first of all, that they're not going to try and cancel the free port policy. I think it would have been very difficult for them to do that, because they have in effect signed up to a 10-year policy that private investors as well as local government have taken financial positions over that 10-year period as a committed policy position. But I do think, and it'll be interesting to see what happens next week, that if this government wants to achieve its goals, in particular trying to chase more growth to be able to fill the gap in public finances that they didn't share with us during the election, I think free ports will play a significant role. And indeed, look at this as an example. I mean, I believe we're about to be invited to Downing Street as the mayors across the country to have a conversation with Keir Starmer about how we can help him deliver those goals. The significant part of that conversation with him is going to be what the government can do to continue to support private investment into those free ports. I mean, he's got two very serious decisions on his desk over the coming weeks, which I don't necessarily think can hang on to a budget in late September, being the investment in net zero Teesside, which is a very large investment by a group of oil and gas companies, BP, Total, Equinor, who want to build the world's first industrial scale carbon capture and storage facility, which should be at the heart of a Labour government's policy making. It's pro-growth, it's pro-jobs, it's pro-decarbonisation, but that's a £20 billion ask from a government to be able to support. And the second one, which again was in the Labour Party manifesto, was the support of steel making in the UK. I mean, British Steel have submitted a bid to government. It is sat on the minister's desk to support them to be able to build electric arc furnaces in the UK, to be able to sustain sustainable steelmaking in the UK for the long term. These things are all happening in free ports on Teesside. There are other aspects I could give across free ports across the country. One of the reasons we've been able to get to this stage on getting a piece of paper in front of the government for them to sign off is because free ports have been such a lightning rod for that type of investment.
So that's clearly something that you were going to be raising in that meeting with Keir Starmer. One of the questions, though, about devolution, and it is something that the Prime Minister has said that he wants to do more of, to devolve power to local communities, is the issue of governance and transparency, because an official report did say that there were some concerns about investment in the Freeport in your area, and that, in fact, you know, some of the decisions didn't meet the standards required of those managing public funds. Are you satisfied that there is enough transparency in the way those decisions are made at the moment?
Absolutely. And you'll see more work come out of that. There were recommendations made in that review, which we absolutely accepted and we're currently implementing. And over the coming weeks, I've actually been working with Labour counterparts in the region to be able to implement those recommendations. I mean, what we found, it was in the run-up to not just the general election, but in the run-up to my election in May. And the Labour Party in my election tried to make my election a referendum on this report and the fantastic work that's happening in the Freeport. Now, I won with 53% of the vote, 54% of the vote, which is the third highest vote share of any mayor in the elections in May. And people absolutely rejected that premise. They saw that we tried our hardest, we tried to do our best, we created jobs and investment. And that's what people care about. They care about delivery.
Just finally, is there anything else that you were going to raise in that meeting? I mean, it's quite unusual, isn't it, for a new Labour Prime Minister to call in Conservative politicians. I'm sure you welcome that cross-party working. Is there anything that you think you can work on with Labour that maybe you've been stuck on under previous governments that you hope you might now see some movement on?
Well, I think obviously I've suggested to you some of the things that I will raise, but the other thing that is important, I think, from a national point of view, rather than just taking a Teesside lens, is trying to understand the detail and I think trying to offer some guidance to the new government on how they actually reform, for example, the planning regime. And I actually talk about this not just in housing terms, but if you are wanting to be pro-growth, we need to build more sheds, we need to build more manufacturing, we need more jobs creating, and there are some significant regulatory blockers to this. It's not as simple as we need to speed it up. Actually, the planning system at the moment allows for very significant planning decisions to be taken within 3 months. That's actually relatively quick. The problem is it doesn't take that length of time because there are government organisations that have put so much red tape and so much additional regulation in place, it makes it impossible. And I want to understand and actually, challenge this government to say, well, if you want to speed it up, you're going to have to ask yourself some very difficult decisions about how democratic do you want this planning policy to be. If you make it undemocratic, it's very easy to get things approved very quickly. How keen are the Labour government to tinker with environmental regulation? Environmental regulation is one of the largest delays in the planning system. So are they serious about doing that? So again, I can offer, as can other mayors across the country, to be fair, offer practical experience of how the planning system works and how serious they are about getting to grips with it, because that could very quickly be a noose around the Labour Party's neck if we're not careful.
Ben Houchen, the Conservative Mayor of the Tees Valley, thank you for joining us on the programme this morning.